Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and in this episode, I'm thinking about the fallacy of the week. Now, recently on social media, there's been a discussion breaking out about the existence of Jesus, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Did Jesus really exist? Yeah, did Jesus really exist? There are some people called mythicists, some scholars who believe that this is all just myth in the sense of made upness, right? Like that word, made upness. That when it comes to Jesus, the whole thing is just littered and covered with made upness. So there's another understanding of myth that just thinks of myth in terms of true story, but we're not talking about that. That's like the C.S. Lewis kind of myth. We're talking about this fairy tale kind of stuff. Was Jesus just made up? Did he really exist? And if so, how can we tell? Well, obviously, one of the ways that we can tell is literature, ancient literature. And when it comes to scripture and thinking about scripture, the reliability of Scripture, it blows any other ancient work out of the water in terms of its reliability. And a lot of people, when they look at Scripture, will say things like, well, the people who are trying to question whether Jesus did exist, they'll say things like, well, you can't use Scripture. That's circular reasoning. It was religious propaganda. It was religiously motivated, so you can't use that, which is just crazy because historians of Caesar and Plato and Tacitus and Suetonius and Herodotus and Horace, they all use works that are by those authors or connected to those persons. And so certainly we can use what Scripture says, particularly the New Testament, to show that Jesus was an actual person who actually walked on earth and said and did things. But there are other pieces of literature outside of Scripture that are reliable as well. And by the way, when we compare the reliability of ancient texts to one another, I think Homer's Iliad which was written around 900 BCE, and our earliest copy is around 400 BCE. So it's just like 500-year time span there. The number of extant or surviving like copies we have related to that is about 640, 645, something like that. And when it comes to the New Testament, which was written in about a 60-year span, that's being kind of generous, could be even less, 30 or 40 years. And our earliest copies about maybe in the early 100s, 120, 125, somewhere around there. We have actually over 24,000 related pieces of data for this or copies of this. So the second best thing we get in terms of documents and surviving copies of those in the ancient world is Homer's Iliad, which is 643. Whereas with the New Testament, we have over 24,000. Like, it's not even close, right? So the reliability of the New Testament in terms of its manuscript count is pretty amazing. You can do that same sort of thing with like the works of Aristotle. We have 49 copies. Demosthenes, about 200. With Plato, 7. Like, that's amazing, isn't it? The works of Caesar, 10. The works of Livy, 20. It's like not even close, right? So we can go to Scripture because we know that it is reliable in terms of just the number of copies that we have, and they're all very, very consistent. No major disagreements within them, though there are some textual variants, but nothing that really changes the story, right? But let's say we just forget about Scripture, right? And all those mentions that we have of Jesus in Scripture. Is there anything else to suggest that Jesus really did exist or didn't exist? right? And so one thing you often hear people say is, um, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And I think that's an interesting point. So even if we rule out the New Testament or any other piece of ancient literature, does it, like, if we had zero literature referring to Jesus, is that sufficient enough proof to prove that he didn't exist? Well, no, because the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? Um, so we have other things like churches being built, or we have ancient graffiti. We have numerous other things like Christian graffiti, right, where they're um, drawing pictures and creating writings on rocks and in certain sacred places that refer to Jesus and even his followers, right? So the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. But let me show you one example of what I'm talking about here, what's going on. And we'll see how the debate, what it kind of looks and sounds like. So this is from Twitter, just a screenshot from someone named George Stiles. He says on June 9th, 2023, there's zero evidence of Jesus actually existing. It's all anecdotal fallacy. Wow. This tweet is an anecdotal fallacy. So an anecdotal fallacy is just suggesting hearsay, right? It's old wives' tales. So that's what he's suggesting, which is a huge fallacy in and of itself, to suggest that what we have in the New Testament, for example, is all anecdotal fallacy. What we have in archaeological data is all anecdotal fallacy. But what about the literature outside of the New Testament? Is there anything historical? Yeah, there is. There's a lot, actually. To call all that anecdotal fallacy, to think that dozens of people, ancient people who are writing and keeping records, are wrong, it's like the height of modern arrogance. So really, to say it's all anecdotal fallacy is to understand genre, literary genre. It's to misunderstand literature, and it's the height of modern arrogance, which is a huge fallacy. Is very fallacious thinking. But to say there's zero evidence is also the fallacy of exaggeration. That's just not true. It's not true, and it's kind of leads to a straw man kind of fallacy, right? So let's look at something else that I want to share with you. This is a graphic created by someone named Wesley Huff, and he's following some of the data that's been detailed in other places. You can find some of this in the works of Josh McDowell and Craig Evans and various other people who have done things with apologetics. But he's created a nice graphic here, which is really good, easy on the eyes, and nice to follow. So you can see that Pliny the Younger here, he's a political document dating to somewhere in the mid 60 CE or AD to the middle of the 2nd century. He mentions that Christ's followers sing to Christ as to a god. So it's mentioned there that he exists. Tacitus, same sort of time period, writing in the historical genre, he discusses Jesus' crucifixion. Now, so are we supposed to rule out this ancient political writer and this ancient historian, who are Romans, you can see? Are we supposed to just chalk that up to anecdotal evidence? What if you're going to say that, then the burden of proof is on you to prove that. So no, we don't do that. Then we look at some Greek literature. Thallus, he's a Greek historian writing in the middle of the 1st century. He describes the strange phenomena in Judea on the day of Jesus' death. Lucian, he's writing an ancient satire. He's writing in the 2nd century, and he mentions Jesus' crucifixion as well, and the habits of Jesus' followers. Celsus, writing philosophy near the end of the 2nd century, says that Jesus was born in Judea, that he lived part of his childhood in Egypt, was a miracle worker. He accuses Jesus of magic powers and all sorts of things. So he's actually attempting to discredit Jesus, but in doing so mentions him. So these are three Greek authors. Are we supposed to chalk this up to anecdotal evidence? Well, if we're going to and call this all just hearsay, then the burden of proof is on us to prove that it's hearsay. We can't just say it is and leave it at that. Josephus, he was part of an early Jewish movement. He's writing history near the end of the first century. He mentions Jesus, James, Jesus' brother, and John the Baptizer, a relative, perhaps a cousin of Jesus. Then you have early Christians writing in the first century and second century as well. You have Polycarp, you have Clement and Ignatius. They're associated with the Christian movement, and they all mention Jesus. Just because they're Christians doesn't mean they don't count. It's historical evidence. And then, of course, you have the Gospels and Paul, which mention Jesus a lot, and the other New Testament documents. And even one thinker, Bart Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He says, and he's not a Christian. Used to be, but he's not anymore. He says, moreover, the claim that Jesus was simply made up falters on every ground. Indeed. So we do have at least 6 early, really 9 non-biblical texts that mention Jesus and do so repeatedly. Again, if we're going to say there's zero evidence, we're just lying and being dishonest. And if we're calling it anecdotal evidence, we're also not either being dishonest or we lack knowledge about literary genre and ancient personages, right? So no, there's no proof that Jesus didn't exist. In fact, the contrary is the opposite. There's a lot of proof, literary proof, that is, that Jesus existed outside the scriptures themselves. And then there's a ton inside the scriptures. We have some archaeological evidence. We have the existence of churches built all over the place over sacred Christian sites and these sorts of things to show that Christians were gathering and they believed in Jesus and so on and so forth. So no, it's not anecdotal evidence, and it's not true that there's zero existence or zero proof for Jesus' existence. In fact, there is an abundance of proof for Jesus' existence, and that proof is only astronomical if we allow in the New Testament documents themselves to this argument, to the tune of 24,000 copies, which blows every other ancient piece of literature in terms of existing copies or extant copies out of the water. So Jesus really exists? Yeah, he really existed. He really existed. All right, I hope that helps.